Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first session for the Association of State Floodplain Managers annual conference, coming to you virtually this year. Thanks for joining. I am Eileen Shader. I'm Director of River Restoration with American Rivers and co-chair of the ASFPM Natural and Beneficial Functions Committee. So I'll be moderating this session, and you should be in A3, Resilience, Definition, Policy, and Practice. I would like to thank our sponsors for this session, Moffitt and Nichols, and say that we're going to have 3 presentations that are about 20 minutes each, followed by about 10 minutes of Q&A. So if you have a question or comment, please add them to the chat box, and then I will read those off for our presenters. Our first presenter is going to be Rob Flaner, who is a Hazard Mitigation Program Manager with Tetra Tech. And his presentation is going to be, what is resilience and why is it important that we define it?
I'm a certified floodplain manager and hazard mitigation program manager for Tetra Tech. I have 30+ years experience in floodplain management and emergency management. I was the former ISO CRS specialist for FEMA's regions 8, 9, and 10 prior to coming to Tetra Tech. And since coming to Tetra Tech, I have managed Tetra Tech's mitigation sub-practice, which includes hazard mitigation planning, grant application support, benefit cost analysis, and community rating system subject matter expertise. During this presentation, I will go over where it all began, the beginning with mitigation. We'll talk about what is mitigation, the emergence of resilience as a goal, what is resilience, the different types of resilience, what does it all mean, resilience defined, mitigation versus resilience, hazard mitigation planning and resilience, targets for achieving resilience, the new norm, followed by a question and answer period. So let's begin by taking a step back in time. Once upon a time in FEMA land, there was a program called Project Impact. It was introduced by FEMA back in 1997 with the object of promoting and building partnerships and setting priorities for target resources to reduce the impacts from future disasters. It was through Project Impact where the term mitigation truly became defined and entrenched in FEMA programs. Project Impact was later replaced by the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 and has become the focal point of all mitigation directives since then. Both programs set the course for FEMA directives and emphasized mitigation for the next 20 years. So what is mitigation? As we just discussed, mitigation became entrenched in the early 2000s, and FEMA actually defined it as it became a program directive. FEMA defines mitigation as a sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to life and property. This graphic shows the 5 phases of emergency management: prevention, protection, response, recovery, and mitigation. The object of mitigation is to make this circle smaller. If we're doing a good job of mitigation, which is risk reduction, loss avoidance, the necessity to prevent, protect, respond, and recover should be less over time. The most important word in this definition is the very first word, sustained. Sustained means we're not looking for the quick fix. We are looking for sustainable actions that have project useful life that reduce risk over a time frame. FEMA's mitigation focus has evolved over time through multiple programs. First, starting with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which provides post-disaster funding after presidential disaster declarations, to the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, which is based upon congressional allocation on a year-to-year basis, as well as the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, which is also based on allocations, to new programs such as HUD, under the CDBG umbrella with the DR, disaster recovery, and the mitigation programs, and with the brand new FEMA program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, which is now what we would call the new norm in mitigation. So let's swing the pendulum to today. Let's fast forward to today. When we talk about mitigation, there's a new buzzword, there's a new word in town. It's called resilience. As the frequency and severity of hazard events has increased over the past 10 years, we are seeing the word resilience used more and more. But what does it mean to be resilient? Here we present a timeline of the emergence of resilience as a goal. Starting back in the Carter administration in 1993, where mitigation gained traction, to the Clinton administration from 93 to 2001, where Project Impact was the cornerstone, to the Bush administration from 2001 to 2009, where mitigation was de-emphasized with ties to growth management and land use, to the Obama administration from 2009 to 2017, where resilience was truly introduced as a target goal under FEMA directives, to currently and starting in 2017 under the Trump administration, where resilience is currently supported by both parties. So what is resilience? The origin of the word comes from the Latin root word resiliere, or to spring back or rebound. The actual definition focuses on absorbing shock, responding and recovering quickly, adapting to a changing environment, and avoiding impacts by proactively reducing risk. The concept of resilience is not a new term, as evidenced by these quotes. Thomas Carlyle once said, "By nature, man hates change. Seldom will he quit his old home till it actually has fallen around his ears." Nelson Mandela referred to resilience as the greatest glory in living lives, not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. To today's practical livelihood, Morgan Mack from Washington Emergency Management. Cavemen figured out how to hunt wild beasts many times their size, build fire to cook the meat harvested from their hunts, and not die from the hundred of diseases that we'll still worry about to this day. That is some serious application of how not to let risks posed by the existing natural hazards negatively impacted your livelihood. There are various types of resilience, starting with engineering resilience, defined as the speed at which a system can regain some level of stability or equilibrium, followed by ecological resilience, which has been defined as the ability of an ecosystem to maintain key functions and processes in the face of stresses or pressures by resisting and then adapting to change. Resilient ecosystems are characterized as adaptable, flexible, and able to deal with change and uncertainty. Lastly, there's panarchy. Panarchy is defined as the capacity to reorganize, the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, and feedbacks, and therefore identify, that is, the capacity to change in order to maintain the same identity. These are graphic representations of the three types of resilience that we just discussed, starting with engineering resilience, going on to ecological resilience, and then panarchy. These are physical representations or graphic representations of what these definitions are trying to define. So what does this all mean? It's very clear that resilience has not one, but multiple definitions. But what is the definition of resilience as it pertains to emergency management? Don't you have to define it if you want to set a metric to achieve it? Mitigation is clearly defined. What is the clear definition of resilience and emergency management continuum? What is the role of mitigation in striving for resilience? With the onset of programs like BRIC, will local hazard mitigation plans become community resilience plans? Some possible answers for these questions are as follows. What is the definition of resilience? Has it been defined? Well, the short answer is, yeah, kind of. The term is being used. Clearly defined? No, I would say no. In a recent search of strategic plans of 8 federal agencies, the word resilient or resilient principles were in all 8. All of these plans had different definition for resilience with no consistency across these federal agencies. These agency plans included FEMA, EPA, HUD, NOAA, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, NRCS, United States Forest Service, and the U.S. Economic Development Administration. The good news is there are some clear definitions out there for resilience. However, you will see some variety. The Rockefeller Foundation, through its 100 Resilient Communities program, has defined resilience as the capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive, and even transform in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks. FEMA has defined resilience as the capacity of people, organizations, or systems to adapt to changing conditions and withstand and rapidly recover from disruption due to emergencies. The National Academies of Science has defined resilience as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. The Hazard and Climate Resilient Institute out of Boise State University has defined resilience as the capacity of a community to prepare for, respond and adapt to, and recover from adverse event or condition, the ability for a community to thrive. And lastly, the Governance and Social Development Resource Center out of Britain has defined resilience as disaster resilience is the ability of individuals, communities, organizations, and states to adapt and to recover from hazards, shocks, or stresses without compromising long-term prospects for development. There were several common threads in all of those definitions, including the words absorb, recover, chronic, individual, transform, adapt, thrive, communities, capacity, withstand, disrupt, adverse, long-term. The list goes on, and you can see a lot of commonalities in these terms. So what is mitigation's role in resilience? Is resilience now the new mitigation? Well, the short answer is no. Mitigation as we know it today looks in the rearview mirror. We use historic hydrographs to map floodplains. We emphasize historic loss effectiveness of mitigation projects. We still refer to statistical and probability when we talk about large-scale events. Mitigation is alive and well, but it will need to evolve as we transition to resilience-based emergency management. Mitigation will need to evolve by becoming more forward-looking. Proactive mitigation will be key for local governments looking to become resilient. How we identify and measure the effectiveness of mitigation actions will need to change. This graphic represents how resilience could be applied to emergency management following the Panarchy model. First, we start with change, and then that creates a release that goes from starting from preparedness to response to recovery, and then a second response, back to preparedness and back through the cycle all again. Hazard mitigation planning can become a cornerstone for community resilience by embracing the proactive driver for generating a good community hazard mitigation plan. These plans can be the link to a long-term forward-thinking vision by integrating with land use plans, supporting recovery planning, providing access to the funding needed to reduce risk, communicating that risk, building both public and political consensus for actions identified. However, to be truly effective in achieving resilience, a local hazard mitigation plan must consider future conditions. In this graphic, we're illustrating a possible design mitigation resiliency planning approach. Starting with the state mitigation policy, which, as we all know in today's mitigation planning directives, it always starts with the state, with the locals planning under the state and striving for consistency with the state plan. But within that confines, a process that focuses on planning capacity, local context, the quality of the plan, with a clear strategy for implementation that measures resiliency outcomes so that those outcomes can be monitored, thus informing future updates to that plan, is solid planning. This is not too far off from the current goals or strategies for solid mitigation planning that we see now. But the key is to identify resiliency outcomes as measurable metrics so that you can monitor whether those metrics are being received to inform future updates. Some targets for achieving local community resilience are as follows. First, make a proactive investment in policy decisions. Next, inject long-range thinking into short-range actions. Expand your definition of risk to include future projections. Understand your capacity to adapt to future conditions, a la what the state of California has required by its recent state mandate, Senate Bill 379. Communicate risk and vulnerability to the whole community, emphasizing a social equity lens, that the whole community and how hazards can impact the entire community. build both public and private sector capabilities and partnerships, and resume normal operations and recover rapidly after hazard events. These can help be good target measures for achieving community resilience. As I said earlier in this presentation, the pendulum is definitely swinging to a new norm, and that new norm is built upon a foundation of resilience. One thing we know for sure, disasters are getting bigger and more diverse. The diversity of these disasters is best illustrated by the recent global pandemic that we are all still experiencing. One thing is very clear, Congress is committed to buying down risk with the onset of programs such as BRIC, CDBG MIT, CDBG DR, and appropriations under the Economic Development Administration. All of these programs include resilience drivers and require planning, which is a good thing. However, most of this funding is available post-disaster, which makes it a challenge to be proactive, which, as we said earlier in this presentation, is a key to being resilient. But there is an opportunity that we have now to integrate mitigation into recovery, which is not the current standard. With the onset of large-scale disasters like Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, where they're large-scale, huge impact disasters that are focusing on long-term recovery, the opportunity for mitigation is strong. It's huge. And that is an actual opportunity to transition into resilience construct, as we illustrated earlier with that panarchy model. So how do you define resilience? One thing we know for sure, there is change ahead. As Bill McKibben so eloquently said, resilience science is based upon the simple premise that change is inevitable and that attempts to resist change or control it in any strict sense are doomed to failure. This needs to be embraced as we strive for resilience. Change is here, it's coming, it's certain. How will we prepare for change in a resilience construct? Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I will now be open for questions.
All right, thank you, Rob. That was fantastic. I'm not yet seeing any questions in the chat box, so if anybody has anything, please feel free to include that, and I will ask Rob. I do have a couple questions. First, I work a lot in the field of promoting the use of natural infrastructure within floodplain management, where we have a lot of confusion over the terminologies. We've got natural infrastructure, nature-based approaches, green stormwater infrastructure, engineering with nature. Some agencies have very specific definitions about an understanding of what those apply to, what sort of practices those apply to. Some are defined in law or policy, and then other people just use them interchangeably all the time. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts or advice about how we can or should work towards a shared vocabulary around these topics.
Yeah, great question. That's one of the reasons I did this paper. You know, it's a big word, and I'm old enough and been around long enough that this kind of the whole paradigm shift. We were all struggling with the word mitigation 20 years ago when it first got coined, and what is it? What does it mean? And it got clearly defined, and FEMA reorganized, and the Flood Insurance Administration became the Flood Insurance and Mitigation Administration, and it was really easy to put it, I guess, in a box and frame it. I don't see it that easy with resilience, and it's such a big word. And as my presentation showed, when you look at engineering resilience versus ecological versus sociological, and they all go in a different direction. I guess my point by all this is when you are using the word, you have to define it. And it's funny, I do a lot of mitigation planning now, and everyone is incorporating some degree of resilience or sustainability into the definition. And every single time I do a plan, I say, how are you defining it? What do you mean by that? And a lot of times they're not looking at what you said. They're not looking at social equity. They're not looking at environmental justice. They're not looking at
the bigger picture of what is resilience. And they're also doing it with in the rearview mirror look, right? Hey, we just got whacked by Harvey. How could I be more resilient for Harvey? And so the point being is, you got to define it. And I think you have to understand all the caveats. I'm thrilled to death that we have a program like BRIC coming down the pipe that has the word resilience in it, that is going to make us take a hard look at what that is, and that we are actually seeing nature-based solutions being incorporated into the conversation, and social equity being incorporated into the conversation. We never saw that before. And what's forcing that discussion is recovery. We're having to recover from events that we've never had to cover from before. Tetra Tech is just finishing up doing the recovery plan for the Kilauea volcano. They lost 2/3 of the developable land on the Big Island of Hawaii from that volcano and displaced 3,500 people. And you start thinking about sociological and cultural issues about, well, I want to go back and build on a lava flow. I've always built on lava flows. And so how do you do that with an equity lens? How do you do that with an environmental justice lens? What is the nature-based solution? And so I'm really excited that the conversation is shifting that way. But I guess the short answer to your question is you have to define it. And in the context of whatever it is you're doing, you have to define it.
Yep, absolutely. We have a bunch of questions streaming in now, so I will shift over there. The first one is, do you have examples of local hazard mitigation plans that address future conditions well?
Yeah, California is forcing it. California passed a state law called Senate Bill 379 that, and it's the right way to do it. They're forcing the integration with mitigation plans and general plans. Now, I will say that it's primarily focused on coastal with sea level rise, but it is the intent of the state that it's even inland communities must address future conditions. So what we're seeing initially is we're finally seeing an embracement of a standard value for sea level rise projections. That was always the challenge with sea level rise, is that, oh yeah, okay, let's acknowledge it. But then you had 15 data sets and everything was printed in a range. Oh, it's 1 to 15 meters. Well, what is it? Is it 1 or is it 15? And so we're seeing a much more concerted effort doing that. It is forward looking in the fact that it is, the best available data and science. It's trying to inform land use. I'd say any California plan that you can see in the last 5 years, you'll see good examples of future conditions.
Great. We have the next question from Phil Dunstan. So along the same lines, how does one balance resilience looking forward to future conditions with the idea that growth is inevitable and must proceed, often pushing into marginal land where new projects are proposed?
Yeah, that's a challenge. And, it's a challenge when you consider we have states that have growth management acts, we have states that don't. And so when we sit there and we look at forward thinking is really trying, when I got into this business, one of the very first disasters I ever worked in was down in FEMA Region 4 after Hurricane Hugo. And it was the Region 4 director at the time said, we're the best nation in the world preparing for the last disaster that happened. And that's true. We're a very reactive society. We're doing a lot of recovery support from Harvey in Texas, and everybody goes, well, it's a 750-year event. Well, no, it's not. In 30 years, it'll be your 100-year event. That's forward thinking, understanding that just because it just happened, that, it takes 30 years to impact a hydrograph. And so you have to expand your thought and your thinking using best available data and science to forward project. And one thing about history and Mother Nature is she gives us trends that we can plot, and we can expand those trends instead of with technology and using that data so we can forward think. But you got to impact core capabilities that you have to be forward thinking, and a lot of that is at the local level is going to tie to land use planning. Everybody has a 20-year or some sort of visionary plan that says, here's how we're going to grow, here's how we're going to monitor our growth. Does that vision have any kind of future protections for impacts to sociologic impacts, environmental impacts, and all the things.
Great. Our next question is from Carrie Sandeman, and I think our next presenter may actually cover a lot of this, but I'll give you a chance to suggest it. The question is, I'd like to hear about specific projects, policies, and programs that exemplify resilience. So other than California, any favorites of yours?
Well, we're starting to see it a lot in recovery planning. Resilience seems to be a big driver for recovery planning. And so recovery planning that we're seeing in Texas, the recovery planning that we saw in New York after Sandy, has a very kind of resilience focus. Sandy, you had the build it back better and principles. And, even what we're seeing in Hawaii, where it is, okay, how do we sociologically and culturally rebuild and recover so that we don't dilute any of that? So I think that's where I'm seeing it a lot in the recovery planning. And I'm starting to see it really trickle into mitigation planning. Like I said, a lot of mitigation plans, we're seeing this word resilience creep up, and so what does that mean? So those are two areas I would say.
Okay. From Dan Albrecht, is the term panarchy going to become a regular thing? And if we promote that term panarchy, I think we're going to lose the public's attention.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's funny, when I first coined it, and I actually a great colleague of ASFPM, his name is Bob Freitag, introduced me to that term, and he's at the University of Washington. So Bob, if you're listening, you'll love it. But anyway, I agree. Panarchy is not going to be a politically acceptable term. But when you look at the figure eight in the kind of the concepts behind it, it really is about adapting, and that really is, to me, is a fundamental component of resilience, is the adaptive capacity. And so we'll have to come up with another name. I'll have to lobby Bob.
Too bad we're not in person at the conference. You could do it over beer, maybe next year.
Yeah.
All right. Next question from Jen Davis is, where does adaptation fit in this discussion?
Adaptation is huge in discussion. The concept of adaptive capacity, and that's really what forward thinking is about, especially when we're dealing with climate change, right? Do I have the capacity to deal with a worse event than Harvey? And that's the point. That's the problem with preparing for the last disaster that happens, is you put blinders on and you don't ask, could it get worse? And it can, and it will. And so the concept of adaptive capacity is fundamental to resilience, in my opinion. That's what I like about the California state legislation. It is really built upon the concept of assessing one's adaptive capacity through climate action planning, climate adaptation planning. So it's huge, and that fundamental concept of adaptation is huge to understanding your capacity to.
I think our next question is asking about adaptability somewhat. Can the speaker react to the frequent conflation between resilience and resistance to change? I mean, building things bigger to resist larger storms versus assuming change and shocks will happen and planning to bounce back quickly. So I think it's getting at adaptability. Would you agree? Yeah.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that's, true resilience is about making informed decisions, right? I mean, we make decisions all the time. Sometimes they're not the best decisions. All I can think about is Sandy and the governor of New Jersey saying, we will rebuild the Jersey Shore. And I remember at the time thinking, why? We have a great opportunity for retreat, and, we're dealing with this in Hawaii right now, where, they're projecting 3 meters of sea level rise in the next 30 years. And all their buildable lands is shoreline. And so we're going to rebuild the shoreline. And so what? So that we're having to make hard decisions in 30 years when we actually could have made informed decisions now. And so I understand it's not always politically correct or politically accurate to to say, listen, maybe the best alternative is to retreat. But in some cases, I mean, nobody's even asking that question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tough question for sure.
Yeah.
It looks like we've got 1 more minute. So our last question from Dennis D is, can you leverage a high performance in CRS with larger mitigation grants?
Can you leverage performance in CRS with higher, what was the last part?
With
I know who Dennis D
with
is,
larger mitigation grants. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so now in the context of BRIC, right? We're losing a cap on federal share on funding, right? It used to be federal share was capped at $4 million. And when you look at BRIC with 6% set aside of all disaster costs in a year, yeah, we're going to see larger scale projects. And we saw that all start with Harvey. And I think that's a good thing. But, you know, that's where resilience is really going to come in, and nature-based solutions, and a lot of this to where, you know, we just can't, you know, go out and build all these structural projects that are going to cost millions and millions of dollars a year to maintain, to keep their project effectiveness. That, you know, there's got to be a balance. We have to have a balance between that and a nature-based solution, or that and a balance between social equity. And so I would hope, and, you know, CRS is a challenge, right? Because CRS doesn't really strive to recognize structural flood control. And it's always been a non-structural program. But it is a program that is equipped to recognize nature-based solutions. So I would say that we have an opportunity there.
Yep, for sure. All right, thank you so much, Rob. That was fantastic. I think we are ready to move on to our second presenter. Up next, we have Matthew Fuchs, an officer with the Pew Charitable Trust, and he will be presenting on how cities and states are using policy to prepare for the next flood. Take it away, Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Fuchs from the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you for joining this presentation, and thanks to ASFPM for allowing me this opportunity to share my work. ASFPM is a great partner of Pew's. We have a lot of common interests when it comes to flood mitigation, and ASFPM is a wealth of expertise that we're fortunate to have as an ally in passing meaningful reforms to how this country prepares for devastating floods. Pew is an international nonprofit that uses evidence-based, nonpartisan analysis to solve today's public policy challenges. I work with Pew's initiative to reduce the impact of flooding on the economy and environment, and we do that by improving federal and state policies. I'm going to spend this presentation telling you about Pew's Mitigation Matters report, released in November 2019, that's focused on how government can better use policy solutions for mitigation. Since we released this research, we've had some great discussions at a Politico Live event in DC, as well as in places around the country like Wisconsin, Washington, New York, and Iowa, to spread the word about our findings and hear about regional experiences with trying to accomplish more with flood mitigation policy. The federal government and states are both making strides in this area, but there remains a large mitigation gap. For example, FEMA has launched a mitigation investment moonshot with the goal of the nation quadrupling its mitigation spending by 2022. And in 2018, the president signed into law the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which is likely to create a new program. It is creating a new program that's likely to significantly increase pre-disaster mitigation spending across the next several years. And in states across the country, we're seeing governors tasking officials with planning for natural disasters with an emphasis on floods. That's why it's so critical for these places to have a menu of options right now to help inform their plans. To help fill this gap, there are sound policy ideas out there that can help states and localities overcome limited bandwidth and resources for mitigation. And Pew has found an increasing appetite to learn about them. So we set out to understand and highlight who's already tried policies locally that are having a positive effect. The resulting report, Mitigation Matters, found 13 state and local policies across the country that have prompted more mitigation to help make homes and families safer, make it so businesses can stay open even after disasters, and ultimately make communities more resilient. And the research identified 3 categories of policies that officials have used to drive key efforts. First, they're using existing resources to help pay for flood mitigation, such as grants and rebates. Second, they're creating new revenue sources for mitigation, like taxes and fees. And third, setting smart regulations to help drive less risky development. There isn't time in this presentation to go deep on each of our profiles of these policies. So I'm just going to touch on a few examples, and I'll give you the website where you can find the full details on our profiles. So in this first category of existing revenue, we have Arkansas, which is a tax credit for wetland restoration. South Holland is a rebate for retrofits to make homes more resilient. Vermont has a policy where they give more disaster assistance as a reward for communities that prepared before disasters. Washington's Floodplains by Design grant program, and Wisconsin's grants for buyouts. So the one I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail is Wisconsin's grant program. So Wisconsin is a state with serious flood issues. In summer of 1993, flooding across the Midwest, including Wisconsin, caused 50 deaths and $15 billion in damage. And to make communities more resilient, Wisconsin's legislature created a grant program that helps property owners leave flood-prone properties and converts their land to open space, such as wetlands and recreational areas. Unlike in some other states where buyout programs give funds directly to property owners, local governments in Wisconsin must apply for the grants on behalf of homeowners and businesses. And since 2000, the program funded buyouts of many structures, and in recent years, the Wisconsin legislature has increased the grantees' share of the project from 30 to 50%. And yet the state is increasingly seeing more and more demand to the point that they really have not been able to meet it. So in this second category, I'm going to talk about now generating new revenue to fund flood mitigation measures by asking residents to help. And in this category, we have Indiana, which has a state revolving loan fund for flood mitigation, Iowa, which has a flood mitigation program that leverages sales tax revenue. And Maryland, like Indiana, has a state revolving fund, but this one's specifically for projects that result in living shorelines. And then Minnesota has used $50 million in bonds to make transportation more resilient. So the one I'm going to focus on is Iowa's flood mitigation program. In Iowa, again, very bad flooding issues in the state. In 2008, floods across the Midwest left Iowa with $10 billion in damage. In Cedar Rapids alone, there are 5,200 homes that were destroyed or damaged. And as the state recovered, policymakers used a portion of federal disaster assistance to create a pilot program focused on watershed-level solutions across multiple jurisdictions. The pilot served as the basis for a competitive grant award that really solidified a long-term strategy to counter flood risk through watershed-level planning. And that led Iowa later establishing a funding mechanism that leveraged a few sources, including a local sales tax revenue. As of October 2017, 10 projects had been approved at a cost of $1.4 billion, with $596 million from sales tax revenue, $360 million from local dollars, and $425 million from federal funds. In Dubuque, the program awarded $98.5 million, which the city matched dollar for dollar with a combination of federal and local resources to build detention basins, replace floodgates, improve the sewer system, and despite a cost of over $200 million, the city estimates that the mitigation project should prevent $582 million in future damage, so almost triple the original investment. And then the last category is regulations. Here we have, of the ones that we profiled, Brevard, which has a no adverse impact certification that requires property owners to show its development won't cause water-related issues for property owners nearby. Fort Collins, which has progressive building codes in the floodplains. Maryland, which makes property owners show that a nature-based solution isn't possible before allowing them to build bulkheads or other hard alternatives. So that's in addition to the revolving loan fund that we featured in our profiles from Maryland. Milwaukee has a set of ambitious goals to use green infrastructure to absorb 50 million gallons in stormwater. And in Norfolk, there's a resilient zoning ordinance that we featured in our profiles. And the one I'm going to talk about is Brevard's no adverse impact certification. So Brevard is a small town in North Carolina, but it's actually one of the wettest places in the United States, second only to the Pacific Northwest. In 2004, there were remnants of a couple of hurricanes that damaged more than 16,000 homes in Brevard, and that's one of the big drivers for why the town decided that they had to take action on this issue. The City Council adopted one of the nation's strongest regulations on construction in the floodplain. They require that new development or structural improvements don't increase flood risk for nearby property owners and communities. This is called a no adverse impact certification. And so much expertise in floodplain management is needed to navigate the regulations that potential builders increasingly see floodplain development in Brevard as cost prohibitive. And because the standards go beyond what's required under state and federal criteria, FEMA has recognized by lowering the premiums of residents who have flood insurance policies under the NFIP in Brevard. And this has resulted in a 10% discount for NFIP policyholders. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the lessons that we learned, we picked up across the profiles featured in our Mitigation Matters profiles. The first was the importance of investing in planning and research to understand the risks. And one of the most effective ways to mitigate flooding is by understanding and addressing the root cause. So for example, in Washington, officials started their mitigation work by using federal funding to study the problem and then asked the state legislature to improve well-researched solutions that cut flood risk. Another lesson learned, make policy changes part of recovery efforts. When communities are faced with cleaning up after a disaster or current flooding, the recovery is an apt time to pass mitigation policies. An example here is Vermont was able to pass its changes 13 months after Tropical Storm Irene. Another lesson learned is using regulations and cost sharing to make projects more affordable. So cities are using their planning and zoning process to limit the impact of flooding. Fort Collins is an example here. They used floodplain regulations, and Norfolk passed its zoning ordinance to encourage housing, infrastructure, and other assets to be built away from flood areas. Tapping into nature-based solutions is another theme that we saw across our profiles. Many communities are using nature-based mitigation, such as restored wetlands along shorelines that serve as a buffer between incoming storms and vulnerable communities. So here we have Maryland's efforts to establish new regulations favoring living shorelines, and quite a few other examples from our report. And the last lesson learned that I'll talk about from across our profiles, the importance of communicating the benefits and engaging stakeholders. We found that mitigation policies are more effective when officials actively engage their residents and help them understand the potential impact on their lives from these policies. Thank you again for the opportunity to share Pew's research. I'd ask if you're interested in checking out the full report, please visit Pew's website. The report is at www.pewtrusts.org/mitigation matters. And to keep updated on Pew's policy and research efforts, please contact our manager, Forbes Tompkins, so you can receive our quarterly email. With that, I'll wrap up this presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Matt. That was great. Once again, folks, if you have questions, please add them to the chat box, and I will ask them to Matt and try and get through as many as possible in the next 15 minutes or so. So the first question, clarifying something you talked about before, was where can we find the Mitigation Matters report reviewing state floodplain policies?
Yeah, thanks, Eileen. So this report is located on our website, Pew's website, and the specific address is www.pewtrust.org/mitigation matters. You can find all of the profiles, all 13 of them, an executive summary, and some of our analysis of the lessons learned that we found across the profiles.
Thanks. Yeah, I've looked through that website, and it's a great design and accessible way to look into a bunch of those case studies that you guys analyzed. I had a question for you. So your presentation covered several strategies, revenue and regulation, et cetera. I was wondering what your thoughts are. Can a community just try one of those, or should they be taking an approach that utilizes multiple strategies to have more of a comprehensive plan? What have you guys seen in your analysis of these case studies? Can one of those strategies work one place, or should they be trying to use multiple strategies at once?
Yeah, that's a good question. They certainly can and probably should be trying to use multiple strategies, potentially from each of those 3 categories that we highlighted in the report. And so some of the profiles, although they might focus on, for example, a regulation, some of the profiles have text boxes that talk about some of the other activities that the city or state has been pursuing on mitigation. So Fort Collins, Colorado, for example, we feature their floodplain regulations, but we also talk about the stormwater utility that they've set up in that city to help fund mitigation projects. So I think it's a combination that is really going to be, the most beneficial. And also, I would say, ideally it would be a combination of funding and programs from different levels of government. And we don't think that cities or even states should be doing this on their own. This should be a combination, a partnership effort across levels of government, including the federal government, to help support these activities.
Great, thank you. All right, I have a question from David Southgate. How are jurisdictions dealing with bought out properties and floodplains that still have structures in place, some of which may be brownfields?
Yeah, that's a huge piece of this. And I think that in some ways that question goes to the need for more resources for buyouts, because even in some of the states that we looked at, like Wisconsin, has a robust program for a number of years. It's been in existence, and they are finding the resources that they can to meet the demand for that program. They aren't meeting the demand. They always have more applications than they're able to provide funding for. So part of that could be where the new BRIC program by FEMA steps up to help to provide money for maybe those properties that are left behind, the projects that aren't funded. But also, I think it's important for cities and states, possibly the federal government, to provide incentives for neighborhoods that agree to do buyouts together, so that we don't get this cheese effect where you have some homes or businesses left over.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked which city in North Carolina. So I think you were mentioned a case study that was in North Carolina. They were wondering which one it was.
Yeah, that was Brevard.
Okay.
Brevard, North Carolina. It's a small town in North Carolina, but it's actually the second wettest region in the country to the Pacific Northwest. And yeah, they've had some devastating storms there and have established their no adverse impact certification, which I believe ASFPM recognizes as a very effective, and FEMA certainly does as well, strategy for addressing flood problems.
The next question is about your discussion of Brevard as well. Can you explain how the Brevard NAI policy earns flood insurance discounts in more detail? You said 10%, so I assume it's through the CRS credits. And do you know what activity specifically is earning a full 2 classes?
Yeah, it's actually the no adverse impact certification that FEMA recognizes as, a floodplain management practice that gets them the 10% discount through the community rating system. So that's something that FEMA recognizes as, because of the deterrence effect on development in the floodplain, where, basically builders, there's such hurdles to have to go through in order to certify that your property is not going to cause flooding in other areas. That's recognized as something that can and should reduce premiums for insurance holders.
Great. And if, since we're talking about no adverse impact, I just wanted to put a plug in. If folks aren't familiar with ASFPM's no adverse impact guides, you should definitely check those out. I believe they're located on the ASFPM Flood Science Center's website. They have a handful of guides that talk about things, everything from mapping to mitigation to floodplain management regulations, and they're really fantastic resources. So I'd recommend folks check those out. All right, our next question was, what resource would be useful in discussing and promoting the cost effectiveness of no adverse impact? It can be perceived as expensive for development and government administration. So any suggestions there?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that, part of it could go to the research that's been done on nature-based solutions. That's where my mind goes to. There have been studies, looking at the long-term benefits for communities that are investing in natural solutions when it comes to, the co-benefits to the environment, maybe more intangible benefits that can be shown for attractiveness of the community and the way that it can increase the quality of life for people who live there, but also certainly, after disasters, the research that's been done showing the losses avoided, like from Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey, there was significant savings that were attributed to wetlands and the role that they played in reducing the impact of surge from the storm. So to the extent that no adverse impact can be used to preserve some of those spaces that should be dedicated to nature, there are benefits you can point to. Of course, there's the National Institute of Building Sciences study that's a little bit more, not quite as specific to
Mitigation.
Nature, to natural solutions, but yeah, that's where my mind goes to, is the benefits of nature. And to the extent that we have shown the benefits economically, I think that can be really effective, although, there's more research to be done on that front, for sure.
Yeah, I'd actually recommend folks interested in that topic check out my colleague Brandon Parsons is going to be presenting later today on a new report that we just released at American Rivers that looks at the economic revenue that can be generated for communities that are engaged in floodplain restoration, floodplain protection activities in more urban areas. So that looks at case studies from across the country. They're focused mostly on Puget Sound because that's where he's located, but there's some great case studies in there. So I'd recommend folks check out that presentation to get at that topic for sure.
Sounds great.
All right, we got about 5 more minutes and a few more questions on here. So during your review of mitigation projects and buyouts, did you identify if there was equal implementation across underserved and affluent communities and districts, or were they disproportionately applied to the more high tax communities? That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think that, certainly a number of our policies did give priority to lower income communities. And so, we think that that's really important for mitigation projects, that there should be priority given to low income geographic areas. Certainly communities with more resources are able to afford mitigation in more instances. But I think it was floodplains by design in Washington, and I believe Iowa as well gave preferences for low-income geographic areas for that money to be used for projects in areas that, frankly, wouldn't be able to afford projects without the funding from the state level. So there are some instances like that. I know that the state revolving loan fund at the federal level, the legislation that's been proposed there would give preference to low-income geographic areas, and those are the types of bills, types of legislation and proposals that Pew really supports, because again, they move the dial more on resilience in the areas that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it.
Right. Here's an interesting question. What are some examples of failed policy options or mitigation efforts that didn't go well? Either they weren't as effective as hoped, or they provided a perverse incentive. Any that come to mind or that you guys came across?
Well, I mean, I think that, one of the challenges with this research is that, we're kind of walking the line between showing policies that have been effective, but we're trying to avoid, I don't know if I did it in this presentation, we're trying to avoid using the word successful. Because I think even with these policies, part of what we want to highlight is the ongoing challenges in these areas. I wouldn't call, any of the states or cities that we looked at as having been successful, and I think that they would be the first, the officials in those places would be the first to say that they have a long way to go because the flooding problem is so challenging across the country, even in places that have started to, to generate some forward momentum. So I think, without getting into too specific examples, we don't have time, but I think that generally the point here should be that even these places, these are not success stories. There are challenges. I think there are a lot of missteps along the way. I think that a number of the policies that we featured included, efforts to manipulate the waterways, lining the waterways with concrete. Maybe some people thought that would be helpful in some ways, but obviously, it backfires significantly, generating faster water flows that result in more flooding. I think that those challenges and sort of missteps are covered in the profiles. So I would just recommend people visit with the profiles, and they walk through, all of the history and the challenges and some of those missteps along the way to, discovering things that work a little bit better.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts on how to convince governments to consider retreat after major storms or disasters?
Well, one of our lessons learned is that you never want to wait until a disaster happens to pursue pre-disaster mitigation. There's no longer pre-disaster at that point. However, that is kind of an ideal time when the media attention is targeted on the issue of disaster to try to pass legislation. They did that in Vermont after Tropical Storm Irene. 13 months later, they passed their policy change to their Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, which is really a very unique and innovative policy that I would really encourage people to check out.
Yeah,
I'd never before researching for this project, but Yeah, I think the other thing I would say is that I think this is, a little softer answer, but I think a huge thing with managed retreat is how we message it. I don't think that the actual, using the term managed retreat is going to be ultimately a very convincing way to communicate the need to relocate inland. And I don't have a great solution for how we should message it, but I think that retreat is something that is going to sort of fall on deaf ears when it comes to the ears of many Americans. And, we can, to the extent that we can reframe it more positively, while admitting the reality that it is a very tough situation to give up communities that people have called home for multiple generations. I think that positive reframing is going to go, a long way toward convincing people that this is something they need to accept. Yeah, that's for sure. And I share your admiration for Vermont's program. I think it's pretty amazing. And I would note that Mike Klein, who directed their Rivers program, recently retired and is doing some consulting work. So if anybody wants to learn more about how they did it, contact Mike Klein. He's fantastic. All right, 30 more seconds for one last question. It sounds like effective mitigation strategy will combine policy solutions 1, 2, and 3. Did you notice any themes from the case studies regarding political palatability of the various policy solutions you propose? Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's a really long process in order to get that political palatability. I mean, one profile that comes to mind is Norfolk, Virginia, where there was a lot of pushback from developers in passing their resilient zoning ordinance, and it took a process of 4 years between the time that it was really proposed. And obviously that city has huge challenges when it comes to sea level rise and adapting, and it took some courage and some follow through, the courage of your convictions to stand up to some of the voices of opposition, and officials were able to push through. One of the things that helped was that they took a survey of the residents to figure out how the community really felt about these issues, and they found that the vast majority of people in Norfolk are very concerned about sea level rise and acknowledge that something needs to be done, and that there needs to be some skin in the game in terms of where they're building, where they're not building. And that was a huge factor. Gave some political cover really to officials to move forward with the resilient zoning ordinance, because they realized that ultimately some of the voices that were opposed to it were being heard a little disproportionate to how the community really felt. So I'd say, as basic as it sounds, take a survey, find out how your residents and business community even really feels about this. Well, thanks so much. All right, we are out of time and have to move on to the third presentation. So thank you so much, Matt. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Eileen. All right, our third presentation is going to be Adam Hosking. He is Global Director for Water Resources and Resilience with Jacobs and and his presentation is going to be on an integrated approach to coastal city flood resilience.
For Water Resources and Resilience. And today I'm very pleased to be presenting to you with my colleague Susie Torriente, our Global Lead for City Resilience. And we'll be talking to you about an integrated approach to coastal city flood resilience. During this presentation, we'll talk about the increasing risks facing coastal cities and the need that creates for us to take an integrated approach to flood resilience. Susie will then share her experiences with developing and delivering that integrated approach. I'll then share some further examples of global projects where we're supporting the delivery of flood resilient coastal cities. And I'll then close with a couple of takeaway messages. So firstly, We know that global cities are growing, both in footprint and population. That's stretching our funding, placing greater pressure on infrastructure and the urban space itself. And making this growth sustainable, affordable, and resilient is a real challenge for all of us. And there's an opportunity for us to use this growth and the investment to promote equality and equity within our cities. And the challenge of delivering future resilience is exacerbated through future global climate change. Now, the exact level of future change remains uncertain, primarily due to uncertainties in future greenhouse gas emissions, but an ongoing change is inevitable, and in relation to sea level rise, we know that's an ongoing increase in water levels. And these impacts of climate change are particularly stark at the coast, where of course sea level rise is added to the challenges faced by our inland communities. And we really don't need to look into the future to see what this might look like. Some of you will be familiar with this data from NOAA, which reports the occurrences of billion-dollar natural disasters in the US. And this clearly shows an increasing trend from the start of this data in 1980 through to the present day. And these storms and severe weather trends all point to a continuously increasing threat to our built and natural infrastructure, and the need to consider change in our resilience planning. And to really illustrate this point of the coast, these are some values from an OECD study reported back in 2013, which considered the 136 coastal cities globally that are considered to be most at risk to coastal flooding under the so-called 1 in 100-year event. This data suggests that the vulnerable population would rise from 40 million today to 150 million by 2070, and the related economic impacts rising from 3 trillion assets at risk to over 35 trillion assets by 2070. This is due to both increased hazards and those socioeconomic changes I've been talking about. And so all of this points to the need for us to focus on resilience and take an integrated and smart approach. And the flooding risks in our cities are complex, particularly in the coastal cities. We have multiple sources of flooding. Looking at the graphic here, from straight stormwater flooding related to rainfall events exceeding drainage capacity, to riverine and fluvial flooding causing regional flooding, to those coastal sources where we are increasingly seeing sunny day flooding, and we'll hear more about that from Susie, where just under normal tidal levels, due to sea level rise, we're seeing street flooding, pushing up groundwater levels as well. And then, of course, we have storm surges where we have tropical and extratropical events causing coastal flooding and major devastation. And these hazards are all acting on cities, which themselves are highly complex ecosystems of interconnected systems. And all of these systems have potential to be impacted by flooding, and then we can have cascading impacts, meaning that the effects of flooding are seldom restricted to a single receptor or a sector within a city. These linkages are really strong and very real and really cause cascading consequences of flooding that we really need to understand and manage. So we really need to take an integrated approach if we're going to achieve resilience in the long term. Our past siloed responses won't meet these evolving challenges, and as we need to move towards a place-based approach whereby we consider the range of interests and challenges facing an area. This provides opportunities for the delivery of co-benefits, potentially supported integrating funding, which of course is a major challenge due to the financial burden being placed on the public purse right now by the COVID-19 response. And it also facilitates engagement with our communities, which will be essential to truly delivering flood resilience. So with that, I'd now like to hand over to Susie.
Well, thank you, Adam, and hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm Susie Torriente, Global Tech Leader for City Resilience at Jacobs, but in my previous life, just last year, I was Chief Resilience Officer at the City of Miami Beach. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about the evolution of our climate adaptation story in Miami Beach and how we operationalized and institutionalized. First, let me take you to Miami Beach. It is a low-lying barrier island, high ground water table, right nestled between the Atlantic Ocean and Biscayne Bay in South Florida. The challenge is that the high ground water table, the low-lying, the fact that it's low-lying, and that it has a lot of aging infrastructure. And the next picture shows a picture of 2013, where the city was experiencing sunny day floodings in the springs and in the fall. You can see that it's a beautiful sunny day. It's not rainfall. The water is actually coming up through the gravity stormwater system and those older pipes. In 2013 also, we had a new mayor campaigning. Philip Levine won his campaign to become mayor on this cry to fix the streets and stop the flooding. And that's when a very aggressive stormwater program began. The next slide shows you that very same neighborhood where we were installing stormwater pumps. We were elevating the roads by at least 2 feet. You can see there in the lower picture, and then creating sort of these split sidewalks. In 2015, in the next slide, this is when I joined the city of Miami Beach as Chief Resilience Officer. And I started working with the engineers and began this process of being a more integrated approach. And we started creating policy in terms of the crown of road elevation, the top of the seawall, new construction, base flood, plus a freeboard of 1 to 5. And so essentially we were taking the best available data that we had, the sea level projections for our region, and creating policy, not only in terms of engineering, but also on the planning side of the house. The next slide, thank you, shows some of those regulations on the land development. Like I said, base flood elevation, freeboard, seawalls. And so we were approaching this not only on the engineering side, but also looking at it from the land use perspective. And the next slide gives us another indication of one of our policies and how it actually played out. This is a new construction in Miami Beach, and you can see that the first inhabitable floor is actually at that BFE at 13 actually. And so new construction in Miami Beach is starting to look like that. The next slide really then outlines our approach. It began with public infrastructure and policy upgrades. We then had private development standards in our land use code. And the third piece that they're still working on after I left is actually design guidelines for historic properties in the face of climate change. And because the city is a very dynamic system, let's face it, all these things have to come in together in an integrated approach. Now, these are the before and after pictures. You saw that picture already, the top corner. This is Sunset Harbor before and after, and you can see that, quite frankly, it worked. The streets are dry when the high tides occur. Unfortunately, it's not very pretty, right? It could be a little bit more attractive. And so we learned from that integrated approach. So fast forward to 2017, a new mayor, new commission, come in and they say, hey, let's sort of step back for a moment and see, let's test our program. Are we doing the right thing? And by 2017, fortunately, we were already members of the 100 Resilient Cities through the Rockefeller Foundation. So with that partnership, the Rockefeller Foundation funded the Urban Land Institute review of our stormwater program. And they gave us some really good advice. They said to, continue with the program. We were on the right track, but it had to be more integrated and it had to be really fit into the larger picture of resilience. And they gave us much, they wanted us to have much more stakeholder input. They wanted us to have more green and open spaces and really just enhance the communication with the neighborhoods. So integration not only within the city, but integration and partnerships with our stakeholders. And so we began this process, what I started calling, the evolution of the stormwater program and Stormwater 2.0. And so that has continued, obviously, since I left. Miami Beach is well on its way to this road to adaptation. The next slide, Adam, if you don't mind. I wanted to touch briefly on what we were doing at the same time during the development and the evolution of the stormwater program. Like I said, we were part of the 100 Resilient Cities, and we were working with our partners at the City of Miami and in Miami-Dade County to develop the resilience strategy for geographic Miami-Dade County. And we came up with this plan, Resilient 305, and it has 3 goal areas: places, people, and pathways. Places because of all vulnerability surrounded by water. People because the building blocks of a resilient community are the people who live there and the opportunities that they have. And then pathways, of course, it's all the different roads on how to get there. The next slide is really an illustration of how climate adaptation and resilience has been working in the South Florida area. And I had the opportunity of really working there for the last 10 years in this space. And we worked not only, at that local level, but we, to use the phrase that folks use a lot, think globally, act locally. We actually also snuck in plan regionally. And so for the last 10 years in South Florida, we've had the opportunity to access all these different networks, from 100RC to the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, which is 4 counties of Southeast, and Resiliency Florida is actually statewide, and it's public-private partnership. I'm still involved in that. And the Resilient Utilities Coalition is actually operationalizing resilience, especially in utilities. And that's a relatively new organization, and I'm involved with that, and hopefully it will continue to grow outside of Florida soon. The next slide just illustrates how this work has to be integrated. And for us in Miami Beach, we put together this kind of illustration to say that it was the City Commission's vision and goals, but it was the management team's mission and objectives and all the actions, right, that we did as a team. The departments had the budgets and the projects to make it happen. And then, of course, we had the benefit of having the influence and the alignment with the regional strategic resilient plan. And then the next slide is really just my take and my summary of the experience over the last 10 years of institutionalizing resilience into the decision-making process. It starts from the top, the leadership, the commitment, whether it's a mayor or the executive. Then I really believe you need to create a structure. You need a plan. With that plan, you have to integrate it with all the different aspects of engineering, planning, the community. There's so many different aspects of a city. A city is dynamic, it's living, it's breathing, it's connected. So you need to make those connections with the staff and training the staff, reaching out to the community, outreach and education, and in partnership with the community. That leads to implementation, of course, and then monitoring and measuring, continuing to build on the relationship, constantly learning, and then repeating all over again. And that's a little bit of my recipe, if you will, for operationalizing resilience. And I'm going to hand it back over to Adam. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Susie. So I'd now like to share some other examples of delivering flood resilient places that we've been engaged in. We need flood resilient solutions that fit the spaces affected, and you've heard about that from Susie. You're recognizing the different challenges faced, the context that exists. You're requiring different solutions and combinations of approaches. And with the delivery of flood resilient communities at the heart of our thinking, we consider a wide range of potential solutions, all delivered in the context of a holistic spatial planning approach and within an adaptive framework. And in the next few slides, I'll illustrate these approaches from some projects we are engaged in around the world. So to start with, is the necessity of taking an all hazards approach to flooding in our coastal cities. As well as flooding, cities face many other hazards, and it's essential that we consider those together in order to deliver consistent levels of resilience for our communities. The graphics on the slide here are from a study we've undertaken in Christchurch in New Zealand, which, as you'll be aware, was affected by a major earthquake, and during the recovery process are looking at flooding and other hazards. And the study here was primarily focused on flooding, but took a much broader approach, recognizing the importance of those other natural hazards, and obviously they were starkly aware, with the aim of providing the best possible information to inform the future layout of the city and its development. And I really like this quote here from the study. Is it worth protecting the city from flooding if another hazard will significantly increase flood risk or cause worse damage? We really need to be thinking integrated in how we deliver our resilience. And we're also taking a multi-hazard approach to our work with the Port of San Francisco, where seismic hazards again remain an ever-present risk. Here in San Francisco, it's currently estimated that there's a 72% probability of a significant earthquake by 2032. And this obviously very directly links through to the waterfront and the flooding risks, as well as its own hazards and risks. And with the flooding, the risk also changes, of course, over time due to sea level rise. So here we're undertaking detailed modelling and analysis to understand the multiple risks, understand their interdependencies, and ensure that our long-term resilience solutions are comprehensive, integrated across hazards, and integrate across the complex urban systems that they operate on at somewhere quite as complicated as the waterfront of San Francisco. And our solutions can be local or regional. They range from property level, asset level protection, such as elevating or floodproofing, as we see here on the left, or even relocation of assets where that's appropriate given the level of risk, through to more community level approaches with flood walls, levees and such like in the middle, through to the larger scale regional solutions like stormwater tunnels from Washington DC here, or storm surge barriers like that we have in place in London. This is the Thames barrier. And of course, the right solution will depend on the place, its needs, its vulnerability, and the integration of interests of all affected communities and stakeholders. In our coastal cities, there's a very important role for green infrastructure and natural nature-based approaches. These have the potential to deliver adaptive flood resilience alongside a wide range of other ecosystem service benefits for our urban spaces. And they can feature at the coastal edge to mitigate rising sea levels and storm surges, or within the city for stormwater management. The figure here on the right-hand side is taken from a study we conducted with the Nature Conservancy for Howard Beach in New York City following Hurricane Sandy. And this study demonstrated the benefits of integrating a range of coastal nature-based solutions alongside some more traditional approaches to deliver more comprehensive solutions for flood resilience in this area of the city, which is immediately adjacent to JFK Airport. And moving over to the northwest, and considering stormwater management, the Dale Ridge Natural Drainage Program in Seattle has developed a watershed scale approach to identifying and implementing green stormwater infrastructure. Now, this green stormwater infrastructure developing water quality as well as street flooding benefits is part of a wider neighbourhood greenways program and is now aligned to the city's Stay Healthy Streets initiative, which is creating a network of local access only streets closing off through traffic to reduce traffic and make these healthy, livable street spaces. And interestingly now, with the reduced traffic that we're seeing due to coronavirus, this program has been extended to include many of the streets that are within that natural drainage system program and their green infrastructure, which is a fantastic example of the stormwater solutions contributing to wider community outcomes. And moving on to consider wider infrastructure, it's vital that our flood resilience approaches address the infrastructure systems that underpin all urban spaces, that integrated ecosystem that I mentioned previously. Understanding the exposure of systems and their constituent assets is essential, as are the potential consequences of that exposure and the potential cascading impacts through systems and identification of the assets that are most critical to those systems. The image here on the right is taken from work we've undertaken for the water infrastructure, flood resilience for New York City DEP, again following Hurricane Sandy. And this illustrates the range of adaptation strategies that were identified to protect the at-risk facilities. These facilities were each then prioritised based on their risk, considering exposure and the consequences of flooding impacts, to drive a programme of resilience investments for the city. And this work on the water infrastructure alongside other aspects of the city then led to the creation of the city-wide climate resilience design guidelines, which you can see here in the centre, which provide for a consistent standard of resilience in all future investments throughout the city. And then coming back to Miami Beach, Susie mentioned the Stormwater 2.0 programme. We're currently engaged in delivering that through the Water Master Plan. And this is considering flooding resilience across all infrastructure for the city. We're incorporating blue-green infrastructure to enhance stormwater management for all of the communities of the city, developing adaptable and flexible road raising policy to reduce flooding risks to roads, which are obviously critical to the health of the city as a whole. And the programme's taking an integrated approach to capital project development and prioritisation to ensure that all critical needs are met throughout the city. The graphic here on the lower right-hand side shows the various combinations of projects throughout the various regions of the cities and how we are integrating long-term resilience and water thinking into that wider programme. I'm thinking more broadly now about how we integrate and deliver these solutions for our cities where we have these evolving risks. It's imperative that we recognise that the risks are not static. These are non-stationary problems. And given the inherent uncertainty in future conditions, particularly with climate change, it's important that our solutions are able to maintain their performance standards into the future. This requires an adaptive approach. Designing and implementing solutions and infrastructure in a way that can accommodate varying future conditions, and then in due course monitoring to proactively manage those systems and adjust them to take action as conditions develop. In our coastal projects, we routinely use adaptation pathways in coastal settings to map out our future decision pathways. The example here is a schematized version of the pathway that's driving long-term flood resilience programme for tidal flooding in London in the UK. Moving from left to right on this graphic, we start with the existing flood protection system, but recognise that with sea level rise, there will come a point, that first green dot, where that system is no longer adequate to provide the level of resilience required for the city. And at that point, we have choices for maintaining resilience. The right choice will depend at that time upon a range of factors, and then we'll implement that, and then in time that approach itself again may reach its own effective limit, the next set of green dots, and so on and so forth into the future. Taking this approach, this adaptive approach, does not mandate today exactly how we'll manage risks into the long term, but identifies the options and their opportunities and constraints associated with each of them into the future. This then drives our monitoring and management programs, and really importantly provides confidence to our communities and investors that resilience will and can be maintained into the long term. And this is another more detailed example considering another coastal flood resilience project, where we see the preferred pathway along which the coloured boxes here, those yellow and red boxes, represent the trigger levels identified for future action, identifying when they've been met and time for action and implementation to adjust our pathway and adjust how we're managing risks. And here I just want to very briefly draw your attention to this box at the bottom left-hand side, which is placing a strong focus on community engagement and linking through to spatial planning. These are not just structural solutions, but we need to bring along a more integrated approach and plan for that and how that itself evolves over time. So to close on spatial planning, it's a vital process for us for the delivery of place-based resilience, integrating everything that we've talked about before and very much part of the story that Susie told earlier. By considering the space as a whole, we can consider the range of options available to us and the multiple needs of our affected communities. We can consider if it may be more prudent to relocate some assets within our urban space to most effectively manage their long-term risks. It provides a vehicle for engagement to optimise return on investment, and again may facilitate a more integrated approach to financing. As my final example, go back to New York City, where we're currently working on the East Side Coastal Resilience Programme, where you can see that flood resilience for the east side of Manhattan is being integrated into the urban space, considering multiple benefits and uses of those spaces to provide wider neighbourhood scale benefits through the investment in flood resilience and infrastructure. So to close, just a couple of takeaway thoughts. Firstly, it's really important that we recognise that we all have a part to play in delivering flood resilience. It's not down to any one body. Delivering resilience is a partnership endeavour requiring shared ownership with our communities and all other players in order to effectively deliver resilience. It enables us to realise the opportunities associated with the resilience investments and to support more equitable city outcomes for our communities. And finally, in order to make progress with flood resilience, hopefully it's been very clear that no one part of government or society alone can act to deliver the right outcomes. Very much mirroring the places, people and pathways pillars of the Resilient 305 strategy that Susie described, in order to make progress, we need an alignment of knowledge, values and rules. Knowledge being the solutions and technologies we have to deliver resilience and address change. societal values that promote and drive a need for resilience, understanding and accepting of change and growing risks, and we need rules, the governance that enables change to occur in order to deliver resilience that doesn't just stick to the status quo. Without all three of these, we can't change, we can't adapt, and we can't become flood resilient. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Adam. We are coming up in the last minute or two, so we'll run through a couple of questions real quick. And my apologies for not introducing Susie early during the introductions. I missed that. First question, shouldn't subsidence through groundwater or petroleum-related withdrawal be included in coastal flood risk, and how to mitigate for it?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, back to the all hazards point. I think every cause of flooding we need to be taking account of, right? Whatever the cause, we should be accounting for it. Subsidence is no different to sea level rise in other locations. So yeah, I mean, if it's almost, regardless of the cause of subsidence, we need to be accounting for it in our hazard mapping and understanding and the risks that come from that. If we can address the cause of the subsidence, great, but we need to understand and address the consequence, certainly, yeah.
Great. Do critical facilities, hospitals, fire and rescue, power stations, etc., have a higher level of protection? And I'm assuming that's applying to Miami Beach.
Well, and it could and should apply to anywhere. And yeah, I think my answer would be yes. I mean, that's not necessarily universally the case, but we absolutely need to understand in terms of that emergency response. When we think of that kind of full cycle resilience, we need to be able to respond and recover. And that, during the event, critical facilities absolutely need to be protected in order to ensure that they can continue to function. So even if a city and neighbourhood goes underwater, we need those facilities to be able to address and respond. So that resilience may look different to them, right? It may not mean that they don't have water near them, but absolutely we need to provide protection to them, and that is certainly part of the thinking for Miami as well.
Great. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have. Sorry for those we couldn't get to your questions. The presentations and I believe the slide decks are generally available after the presentations in the conference, so folks can take another look if you missed anything, and get in touch with our speakers if you want to follow up on any questions. So thank you, Adam. Thank you, Susie. And thank you to everyone who attended our session today. Thank you.
Bye.